FTP or functional threshold power is a widely used metric in endurance sports. It basically assesses how good someone's cardiovascular capacity is. The more power an athlete can push at this threshold, the higher the chances will be he or she will perform better in competition. It's actually a better predictor for performance than, for instance, VO2 max or other metrics. But what about functional fitness athletes? Athletes who compete in CrossFit or HYROX? Obviously, the demands for those sports are completely different than those for endurance sports. The workouts are shorter, more intense, and there's always a mix of stamina, strength, and technique. There's much more to CrossFit than just having a good engine. In this video, I will reveal the results of a survey we did with our followers, most of them during CrossFit, and asking how high their FTP actually was. The question was, do advanced CrossFit athletes actually have a higher FTP than beginners or intermediates? And how do those, let's say, CrossFit FTPs stack up to those of elite endurance athletes such as cyclists? I thought the data was pretty striking, so let's jump straight into the video. Hi everyone, my name is Gomar Dulst. I am a senior scientist at ETH Zurich, based in Switzerland. And for the last decade or so, I studied and taught different aspects of exercise physiology, and now I want to bring some of that science back to you guys. So first of all, what is FTP, or how should we consider FTP? Initially, it was said that FTP is your average power that you can maximally sustain for a 60-minute all-out effort. For example, you hop on the bike for 60 minutes, you pedal as hard as you can, and that average power would be your functional threshold, right? Obviously, this is not very feasible for many laboratories and also athletes. I mean, 60 minutes, who likes to do a 60-minute all-out time trial? So they decreased the amount of time to 20 minutes and took then 90 to 95% of that 20-minute power. That you can consider in most circumstances as a quite good estimate of the maximal amount of power you can aerobically produce, mostly in monostructural work such as rowing or cycling. That's interesting and also very well known in the, let's say, the endurance world. But what about functional athletes? I wanted to know what would be the FTP in more CrossFit athletes or even HYROX athletes. We'll get to that later in the video. So I went out on wod-science, our Instagram platform, and I asked the followers to fill out a survey where they filled out their FTP, but also the level in CrossFit. So the open percentile they were at which, let's say, machine or which erg they did their FTP, obviously very important, and also their body weight and also some other CrossFit specific variables that I will reveal later in this video. And quite interesting, I would say, there was a lot of interest in this survey, this little Google survey. We had 106 participants that usually or predominantly did CrossFit, of which 83 men and unfortunately only 23 women, and also some HYROX athletes, but this was only 17 participants. And obviously, because that's such a low number, I'm not going to include those data in this video because it's just too low. But this is maybe a good opportunity to ask you, if you are watching this video and you are doing HYROX and you know, for example, your 5K running time, right? Or you have done some kind of FTP test, please go to the link in the description and fill out your data there, because I want also to make a HYROX specific video on FTP later, because obviously I think it's a little bit even more relevant. But back to CrossFit, let's look at the FTP numbers for CrossFit athletes. And I have to say the data looked very nice, like quite clean. Most people actually filled out their whole series of data pretty well. And as I said, I had different levels of CrossFit based on the open performance. So below 50 percentile would be a beginner, between 50 and 80 percentile of the open, like the final rank of the open, would be, let's say, an intermediate athlete. And then obviously you have the 80 to 95th percentile would be an advanced CrossFit athlete. And then also you have everything above 95th percentile. So the top 5% of people would be considered as elite CrossFit athletes. And you see that there is actually a significantly higher FTP in the elites compared to all the three other levels. But in between those other levels, there is no difference. It could be that you are an intermediate CrossFit athlete, but your FTP is let's say, the same or even slightly lower, only slightly lower than an elite athlete. So again, this already shows that FTP per se would not be considered as the best predictor of overall CrossFit performance. If we look at the actual values, right, like the actual watts, like the absolute numbers. We're looking at a beginner has 224 watts on average, obviously. Intermediate, a little bit higher, but not significantly, 227. Advanced, 248. And elite has 286 watts. And this is, again, not FTP per se, but rather 20-minute average power on an all-out test on the bike and also on the rower. I will get into the specifics on that. But in most circumstances, FTP is not considered as a raw number, but rather as a relative number to the body weight. So I also asked the body weight, and here you can see the watts per kilogram in FTP. Again, it's almost the same pattern, right? Like the beginners, intermediate, and advanced have kind of the same. There's a slight increase in those categories, but not dramatically. And then you have a significant increase if you get towards the elite level. We're looking at 2.55 for the beginners, intermediate 2.74, 2.75 for the advanced, and the elite athletes is going to be above 3, so 3.25. So there is some differences on this big data set in FTP, which I thought was quite interesting, quite understandable as well, but still interesting to actually see in data format. So how does this stack up to any published data on CrossFit athletes and FTP or critical power, or at least any endurance parameter? And maybe you remember, but in June of 2024, so last year, we published a paper where we physiologically profiled elite CrossFit athletes. I will link also the paper in the description for you to fully read. But what we did there is actually an exercise test to exhaustion in elite CrossFit athletes and P95 percentile, so higher than P95 percentile CrossFit athletes. So well-trained, well-equipped athletes. And we assessed the critical power as well. So it's a test. I'm not going to go too much into it. It's very similar as FTP. It's a slightly higher value, but the goal is also to understand how high the aerobic production of power would be in those athletes. And you see here, the well-trained athletes, the median would be 314 watts, so very close to what we just saw. And the elite athletes, and those are the ones that even are better than the P95 percentile. If you read the paper, you will understand. These are semi-finalists and games athletes. They're looking at 334 watts per kilogram. So again, it's not exactly the same as FTP. It's slightly higher, usually critical power, than FTP, but it's kind of the same ballpark, looking at 3.78 watt per kilogram for the elite athletes and 4.02 watt per kilogram for the elite athletes. Let's call them like that, well-trained versus elite. All right, so it is slightly higher than the data set I just showed, but in the ballpark of 3.5 to 4.0 would be a very good watt per kilogram FTP, as you can see here. Okay, so this is mostly in CrossFit athletes. We're looking at high FTPs above 3. That's already in men a good value, so to speak, right? But how does this stack up to elite cyclists, right? And there's a lot of data on elite cyclists because obviously you have Strava data files. The cyclists, they put on their whole data set, for example, of a competition on Strava. And then with some algorithms and some machine learning, you can actually assess or at least estimate the FTP, so the true FTP, which would be the watts during a 60-minute all-out effort. And here you can see this is from some time ago. Some of the familiar names in the elite cyclist world, like Mathieu van der Poel, Conor Dunne, Daniel Oss, Tom Dumoulin, Ben Swift, so all well-trained, very highly equipped cyclists. They are always sitting at 5.5 to 6.0 FTP, all right? So substantially higher than the elite CrossFit athletes, even the ones that are published. We are looking at 45 to 50% higher values here, mostly relative, so the watt per kilograms, but also just look at the absolute numbers. Some athletes were pushing 490 watts for 60 minutes, right? So that's really crazy. Also 430, 440. That is like, if you don't push more than 400 watts on an FTP, you're not going to be considered as an elite cyclist. Certainly not some years ago, and certainly not now. All right. So that's I think quite interesting. That even though the elite CrossFit athletes obviously can produce a lot of power, both aerobically and anaerobically in a short window of time, for example, 10 to 20 minutes or 4 to 20 minutes. If you look at true endurance capacity, they're well below the specialists such as endurance cyclists, which is understandable, but this is cool to see actually in data. Before we go on to the FTP or the differences in FTP between a bike erg and a rower, because there were actually some differences, I want to quickly talk about our training plans. So we have several training plans specifically for functional athletes that cover the wide range of modalities that you need in functional fitness, such as weightlifting, strength, and mixed modalities, but also endurance capacity. And we try to really focus on building that engine using different protocols to improve your FTP. So if you are interested, just scan the QR code that is popping up on the screen or just look at the link in the description. We have a couple of good training plans that you can just hop in to improve your overall fitness in functional fitness. Good. What about the differences between doing an FTP test on the bike versus a rower? I think that's quite useful if you are a coach watching this video and you are doing sometimes an FTP test on your athletes, which I would actually strongly advise you to do. Are there actually differences? You see here on the left side that, let's say, the patterns are the same. We have lower values in the beginners and then a significantly higher values in the, let's say, advanced and certainly in the elite athletes, both on the bike and on the rower. But interestingly, at least to me, that if you just did a t-test, so you just compared the bike FTP versus the row FTP, there is a highly significantly higher value in the bike. So we're looking at on average of all the athletes who recorded their FTP, 265 watts on the bike and only 219 or 220 watts on the rower, right? So that's quite interesting. That it's physiologically, that doesn't make much sense because you can actually generate more power on the rower compared to the bike because you use more muscles, right? That's also why usually there is a higher VO2 max, for example, in elite rowers, because they just use all the muscles and obviously the oxygen has to go there. But this seems not to be the case. It could be that CrossFitters are just not that good in transferring their cardiovascular capacity into a rower compared to a bike. For the rest, I cannot really explain these results, but this is something you can also consider to if you want to compare bike versus row FTP. I thought this was quite interesting. And then I also surveyed different or more variables that could be related to CrossFit, and I asked them also what their 1 rep max back squat was, so their total weight, their maximal weight, as well as their Cindy performance. So Cindy is a workout very typical in CrossFit. Most of the CrossFitters who are looking at this will definitely know. It is a 20-minute AMRAP, so a 20-minute effort of 5 pull-ups, 10 push-ups and 15 air squats, as many rounds as possible. It's a relatively good test, I would say, for endurance capacity in CrossFit functional fitness. Good. And also many people have done this. And indeed, there is some kind of correlation between the back squat, for example, and the FTP. These are raw numbers, right? So the higher the back squat, also the higher FTP. This makes somewhere sense because it's simply CrossFit is a generalist sport. You have to be good at your back squat as well as your, let's say, cardiovascular capacity, which are obviously two different parameters of the whole fitness spectra. But if you want to be good at CrossFit, obviously both have to be good. I think if you would do a similar survey in pure endurance athletes, for example, cyclists or even rowers, I think it actually could give you a negative correlation. The ones who can do the best back squats actually have the lowest FTP. You also see this, for example, that the sprinters like Mark Cavendish or other elite sprinters in the endurance world, they could never follow on the mountains, so they could never have a high FTP. So there would be a negative correlation, right? But in CrossFitters, this is not the case because they need to be good at everything. The same for Cindy. The more reps they could do on Cindy, self-reported obviously, also the higher their FTP was. This is kind of understandable because those two are measuring a very similar, let's say, physiological effect. Cool, so this was the men. I have most data on the men, obviously, because I have 83 data points, which was quite substantial. And I could, as you can see, I could actually do some statistics on that data and so on. But what about the women? The women also filled out their data, but Unfortunately, less women did it, and I only have a data set of 23 women. So take this data a little bit with a grain of salt. What you see here is there's, because of the data and there's less data points, there's no significance here, right? But you see that the advanced as well as the elite athletes do seem to have a higher FTP. And what is that in let's say raw numbers? The beginners would have a FTP of or a 20-minute all-out watt test of 160 watt, intermediate very much the same, 162 watts, and then we get to the better, let's say, data set, more people. We have advanced sitting at 215, 216 watts, and the elite at 205 watts. So because of the little amount of data, there is some discrepancy here. But interestingly, if you let's say even that out by body weight, it does seem that let's say the more advanced athletes, the advanced as well as the elites, do seem to have a higher FTP in watts. And actually this FTP was quite substantial, right? We're looking at 1.7 for the beginner, 2.3 for the intermediate. The advanced athletes had 3.17, and the elite also had the same 3.2 watts per kilogram. And if you compare that to, again, the data we gathered from our physiological study in elite CrossFit athletes, we are looking at a very similar data set as what we saw for the men, where the critical power for well-trained athletes was 221 watts and 224 for the elite athletes. So also no discrepancy between elite and advanced there. So that is very much in line with what we see from this survey, also on the relative base. So how would this compare to, for instance, elite cyclists on the female level? Because you also have those data. I got those from Pro Cycling UK. I will also put the link to those data in the description. And you see here that, for example, Christian Faulkner, Jesse van Bulke, all have a, let's say, an FTP of above 4.5 to 5.5, right? So slightly lower also in relative terms than the males, but yeah, also 30 to 40% higher than the CrossFit athletes. According to my calculations, the difference between the elite cyclists on the women's side and the elite CrossFitters was less than what we saw from the males, the differences between the CrossFitters and the elite cyclists. So that's quite interesting to see. It seems that CrossFit seems to induce quite some good cardiovascular adaptations, specifically in women. But obviously that is something we have to look at a later point and more in depth. So what can you take home from this survey? I think, first of all, let's say advanced CrossFit athletes. So most, let's say the people who watch these videos are not the absolute elite athletes, but intermediate to advanced athletes, would have an FTP, or at least a 20-minute all-out test of around 250 watts for the males. According to their body weight, this would be 2.75 watts per kilo, right? If I do a FTP, I'm sitting exact at those numbers. And I am, let's say, also an advanced CrossFit athlete. Not elite, certainly not, but I'm relatively advanced. For the women, obviously, those absolute numbers are a bit lower, 216 watts and 3.17 watts per kilogram. So relatively a little bit higher. Could also be because women in CrossFit are actually pretty low in body fat and high in percentage of muscle. That's also why could be skewed a little bit. Good. And then elite CrossFit athletes do have a significantly higher FTP than their counterparts in the, let's say, intermediate and advanced level. So FTP seems to play somewhat of a role. It does make sense to improve your FTP if you want to get to the next level, right? Doesn't mean that everything is determined in CrossFit by FTP, but it seems that if you can produce more power aerobically, that on the long term, it could also help you, for example, for recovery and also for just doing better in workouts. And elite cyclists, so the holy grail of endurance athletes, together with triathletes and rowers and so on, do have a substantially higher FTP than elite CrossFit athletes. And I'm talking about really elite athletes, also the ones that are competing at the CrossFit Games or at the semifinals. So really good data set. And then, unfortunately, as I already said, the data on HYROX for now is missing, but it would be highly interesting to also know a little bit more about HYROX, because HYROX is much more related to endurance sports, and FTP, I think, has a much more significant role in that sport. So if you are participating in HYROX and you like HYROX and you also know your FTP, specifically running, so for example, a 5K running time, that would be, it's not an FTP, but it would be close to what we would consider the FTP in functional athletes. Please go to the link in the description and fill out your scores. So whatever, in a couple of weeks or months, I can also make a HYROX specific video. All right, that was it from my part today. If you are interested in training with us, joining the training community and actually training in an evidence-based way for functional fitness, just go to the link in the description and check out our training plans. I also open sourced all the data, all the survey data. You can find that in the link below this video, because if you want to look at the data yourself and play around with the data, just drop me an email if you found some other interesting relations or correlations. Happy to share here as well on the channel. If you want to learn more what the physiological differences are between competing in HYROX at a high level and competing in CrossFit at the CrossFit Games, just click the video that is popping up right now. All right, thanks for watching. See you later. Ciao.